In the manicured gardens of a British colonial estate on the outskirts of Calcutta, where the humid air carried the scent of jasmine and the distant smoke of funeral pyres, a gardener named Didi Sharma would become the victim of one of medicine's most horrifying transformations. What began as a simple cut from a rose thorn in 1909 would evolve into a nightmare that challenged everything physicians understood about human skin, viral infection, and the boundaries between plant and animal life. Over the course of 2 years, Sharma's body would gradually transform into something that seemed more tree than human. His hands becoming gnarled clubs of bark-like tissue, his limbs sprouting branch-like protrusions that made him appear as if he were slowly metamorphosing into the very plants he had once tended. His case would become a medical sensation throughout the British Empire, documented in journals and photographs that captured the horrifying progression of a disease that seemed to mock the very nature of human existence, turning a man into a living tree that bled and suffered with every movement. The Calcutta of 1911 was the jewel of the British Raj, a sprawling metropolis that served as the commercial and administrative capital of British India. The city was a study in contrasts, where the opulent mansions of British officials and wealthy merchants stood alongside the crowded busties where millions of Indians lived in conditions of desperate poverty. The Hooghly River, a distributary of the sacred Ganges, flowed through the heart of the city, its muddy waters carrying the commerce that made Calcutta one of the world's busiest ports. Ships from London, Liverpool, and ports across the empire docked at the ghats along the riverbank, unloading manufactured goods and loading the jute, tea, and cotton that formed the backbone of Bengal's colonial economy. The riverfront was a constant hive of activity, with coolies carrying massive bales of jute and cotton, merchants haggling over prices in a dozen languages, and British officials overseeing the flow of goods that enriched the empire. The air was thick with the smell of spices, coal smoke from the steamships, and the ever-present humidity that made even simple tasks exhausting for Europeans unaccustomed to the tropical climate. The city's Garden Reach district, where Didi Sharma worked, was home to some of Calcutta's most magnificent colonial estates. These sprawling properties, with their neoclassical mansions and meticulously maintained gardens, served as retreats for British officials and businessmen who sought to recreate the pastoral elegance of English country life in the tropical climate of Bengal. The estates were designed to provide their owners with a sense of familiarity and comfort in an alien environment, featuring English-style gardens, cricket pitches, and social clubs where the British community could gather to maintain their cultural identity. The contrast between these luxurious enclaves and the poverty of the surrounding Indian neighborhoods was stark and deliberate, serving as a constant reminder of the colonial hierarchy that governed every aspect of life in British India. The estate where Sharma was employed belonged to Colonel Reginald Ashworth, a retired military officer who had made his fortune in the jute trade and who prided himself on maintaining one of Calcutta's finest botanical gardens. The property covered over 50 acres and featured an extraordinary collection of plants from across the empire: roses from England, orchids from Burma, spice plants from Ceylon, and exotic flowering trees from the Malay Peninsula. Colonel Ashworth was a man of refined tastes who had spent considerable time and money creating a garden that would rival any in England. He had imported not only plants, but also soil, fertilizers, and even garden ornaments from Europe, determined to create a perfect English garden in the heart of Bengal. The project had become his obsession, and he spent hours each day walking through the grounds, inspecting every flower bed and tree with the eye of a perfectionist. The Colonel's passion for gardening was matched by his appreciation for the skilled Indian gardeners who made his vision possible. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who viewed their Indian employees as little more than manual laborers, Ashworth recognized and valued the expertise that men like Didi Sharma brought to their work. Dedi Sharma had been born in 1873 in a small village in the Hooghly district, the son of a farmer who had lost his land to debt and had brought his family to Calcutta in search of work. Like thousands of other rural migrants, the Sharma family had settled in one of the city's bastis, where they lived in a single room that housed 3 generations of the family. The basti where the Sharmas lived was a maze of narrow alleys and cramped dwellings that housed the city's working poor. The conditions were appalling by any standard. Open sewers ran between the buildings, clean water was scarce, and disease was rampant. Yet for families like the Sharmas, who had lost everything in the countryside, even these harsh conditions represented hope for a better future. Dedi had shown an early aptitude for working with plants, displaying an intuitive understanding of their needs and an ability to coax growth from even the most challenging specimens. As a child, he had helped his father tend a small vegetable garden behind their village home, and he had demonstrated an almost mystical ability to understand what plants needed to thrive. His reputation as a skilled gardener had eventually brought him to the attention of Colonel Ashworth's estate manager, who had hired him in 1895 as an assistant gardener. The position represented a significant step up for the Sharma family, providing steady income and the opportunity for Dedi to develop his skills under the guidance of experienced European and Indian gardeners. Over the years, Dedi had worked his way up to become the estate's head gardener, responsible for maintaining the extensive flower beds, vegetable gardens, and ornamental plantings that made the property famous throughout Calcutta's British community. He was particularly skilled at cultivating roses, having developed techniques for adapting English varieties to Bengal's challenging climate of extreme heat, humidity, and monsoon rains. The rose gardens were Colonel Ashworth's particular pride, featuring over 200 varieties that had been carefully selected and bred to thrive in the tropical environment. Dedi had become an expert in the complex art of rose cultivation, understanding not only the horticultural requirements of each variety, but also the subtle adjustments needed to help European plants adapt to Indian conditions. Dedi was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his almost mystical ability to diagnose and treat plant diseases. He could identify problems with plants before they became visible to others, and he had developed his own remedies using traditional Indian knowledge combined with modern horticultural techniques learned from European gardening manuals. His expertise extended beyond mere cultivation to include plant breeding, pest control, and soil management. Dedi had created several hybrid varieties of roses that were particularly well suited to Bengal's climate, and his innovations had been adopted by other gardeners throughout the region. The gardener lived in a small cottage on the estate grounds with his wife Kamala and their 3 children, 2 daughters, Priya and Meera, and a son named Ravi, who showed promise of following in his father's footsteps as a gardener. The family was relatively prosperous by the standards of their community, and Dedi was respected both by his British employers and by the other Indian workers on the estate. The cottage was a simple but comfortable structure with 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a garden where Kamala grew vegetables and herbs for the family's meals. Dedi had taken great pride in improving the cottage over the years, adding a veranda where the family could sit in the evenings and a small workshop where he could prepare plant medicines and maintain his gardening tools. Kamala was a skilled seamstress who supplemented the family income by making clothes for other estate workers and their families. She was also knowledgeable about traditional Indian medicine and often helped treat minor illnesses and injuries among the estate's Indian community. The Sharma children attended a small school that had been established for the children of estate workers, where they learned to read and write in both Bengali and English. Colonel Ashworth, despite his colonial attitudes, believed in providing basic education for his workers' children, recognizing that literacy would make them more valuable employees. Dedi's work brought him into daily contact with a vast array of plants, many of which had thorns, toxic saps, or other defensive mechanisms that could cause injury to unwary gardeners. Over the years, he had suffered numerous cuts, scratches, and minor injuries from his work, but these had always healed quickly and without complication. The estate's gardens were home to plants from across the tropical world, many of which possessed natural defenses that could be dangerous to humans. Didi had learned to identify and handle these plants safely, but the sheer variety and number of potentially hazardous species made occasional injuries inevitable. His experience with plant injuries had taught him to treat even minor cuts and scratches seriously, cleaning them thoroughly and applying traditional remedies to prevent infection. He had developed his own collection of medicinal plants that he used to treat wounds and injuries, and his reputation as a healer extended beyond his gardening skills. The injury that would change Didi's life forever occurred on a humid morning in June 1909, while he was pruning a bed of hybrid tea roses that had been imported from England. The roses were Colonel Ashworth's particular pride, and Didi took special care in maintaining them, despite the challenges posed by Bengal's climate and the various pests and diseases that threatened European plants in the tropics. The morning had started like any other, with Didi beginning his work before dawn to avoid the worst heat of the day. The rose garden was located in a sheltered area of the estate where the plants received morning sun, but were protected from the harsh afternoon heat by a grove of mango trees. As Didi worked to remove dead blooms and shape the rose bushes, he was focused on a particularly vigorous climbing variety that had grown beyond its intended boundaries and was threatening to overwhelm neighboring plants. The rose was a beautiful specimen with deep red blooms, but its aggressive growth habit required careful management to prevent it from taking over the entire bed. As he reached deep into the bush to cut a particularly troublesome cane, a long thorn from the climbing variety pierced the palm of his right hand, creating a deep puncture wound that bled more heavily than such injuries usually did. The thorn had penetrated nearly an inch into his palm, and Didi had to work carefully to extract it without breaking off the tip inside the wound. The thorn was unusually large and sharp, and the wound it created was deeper and more ragged than the typical scratches that Didi had experienced in his years of gardening. The bleeding was also more profuse than normal, and it took several minutes of direct pressure to control the flow of blood. Didi cleaned the wound with water from the estate's well and bound it with a clean cloth, expecting it to heal within a few days, as such injuries always had in the past. He applied a paste made from turmeric and neem leaves, a traditional remedy that had always been effective for treating cuts and preventing infection. However, within a week, Didi noticed that the wound was not healing normally. Instead of closing and forming a scab, the edges of the cut remained open and began to develop a strange, hardened appearance that was unlike anything he had seen before. The skin around the wound became thick and rough, taking on a texture that reminded Didi of tree bark. The color also changed, becoming darker and more mottled than normal skin. Most disturbing of all, small, hard growths began to emerge from the wound itself, forming irregular protrusions that were painful to touch and that seemed to grow larger each day. Initially, Didi attributed these changes to infection and treated the wound with traditional remedies that his grandmother had taught him: turmeric paste, neem oil, and other herbal preparations that had always been effective for treating cuts and infections. He also consulted with Kamala, who was knowledgeable about traditional medicine, and she prepared additional remedies using plants from their garden. However, these treatments seemed to have no effect on the strange growths, which continued to expand and multiply. If anything, the traditional remedies seemed to irritate the affected skin, causing increased pain and inflammation without providing any healing benefit. Within a month of the original injury, the bark-like growths had spread across most of Dede's right palm and had begun to extend onto his fingers. The growths were hard and inflexible, making it difficult for him to bend his fingers or grip tools properly. The affected skin was also extremely sensitive, cracking and bleeding whenever Didi tried to use his hand for normal activities. The transformation was not only physically debilitating, but also deeply disturbing to witness. What had once been normal human skin was becoming something that looked more like the bark of a tree, complete with ridges, furrows, and the rough texture that characterized woody plant tissue. Colonel Ashworth, noticing that his head gardener was having difficulty with his work, inquired about the problem and was shocked to see the condition of Didi's hand. The colonel had seen many tropical diseases and injuries during his years in India, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of human skin that appeared to be transforming into plant material. The colonel immediately arranged for Didi to be examined by Dr. James Morrison, the estate's physician and a graduate of Edinburgh Medical School who had served in India for over a decade. Dr. Morrison was known for his expertise in tropical medicine and his willingness to treat Indian patients with the same care and attention that he provided to British clients. Dr. Morrison's initial examination of Didi's hand revealed a condition unlike anything he had encountered in his medical training or practice. The growths were indeed bark-like in appearance and texture, forming irregular root-like protrusions that seemed to emerge from the deeper layers of the skin. The affected tissue was hard and inflexible, but it was clearly living tissue that bled when cut and that showed signs of continued growth. The physician's first hypothesis was that Didi was suffering from some form of tropical infection, possibly caused by a fungus or parasite that had entered through the thorn wound. India was home to numerous exotic pathogens that could cause unusual skin conditions, and Dr. Morrison had seen several cases of fungal infections that caused dramatic changes in skin texture and appearance. He prescribed antiseptic treatments and the latest antibiotics available at the time, including carbolic acid washes and mercury-based ointments, that were considered state-of-the-art treatments for skin infections. However, these treatments had no effect on the progression of the growths and, in some cases, seemed to cause additional irritation and pain. As the condition continued to worsen, Dr. Morrison consulted with colleagues at the Calcutta Medical College, sharing photographs and detailed descriptions of Didi's symptoms. The medical college was one of the premier medical institutions in Asia, with faculty who had experience treating the full range of tropical diseases and exotic conditions that were encountered in the British Empire. The case attracted the attention of Dr. William Henderson, a dermatologist who had studied unusual skin conditions throughout the British Empire and who had recently returned from a research expedition to study rare diseases in Burma and the Malay Peninsula. Dr. Henderson had developed a particular interest in conditions that seemed to blur the boundaries between human and plant pathology. Dr. Henderson's examination of Didi revealed that the bark-like growths were not caused by infection, but appeared to be the result of some form of abnormal skin growth, similar to conditions he had read about in European medical literature. He suspected that Didi might be suffering from a rare genetic disorder that had been triggered by the thorn injury. The physician was particularly intrigued by the plant-like appearance of the growths, which seemed to suggest some form of interaction between human tissue and plant material. He theorized that the thorn injury might have introduced plant cells or genetic material into Didi's body, triggering an immune response that was causing the abnormal tissue growth. Dr. Henderson arranged for tissue samples to be taken from the affected areas and sent to laboratories in London for analysis using the most advanced techniques available at the time. The process of collecting and shipping the samples was complex and time-consuming, requiring careful preservation to ensure that the tissue would remain viable during the long journey to England. The results, which arrived several months later, confirmed Dr. Henderson's suspicions, but also revealed something even more extraordinary than he had expected. The analysis showed that Didi was suffering from an extreme case of epidermodysplasia verruciformis, a rare genetic condition that made the skin highly susceptible to human papillomavirus, HPV, infection. Epidermodysplasia verruciformis was a condition that had been described only recently in medical literature, and very few cases had been documented. The disorder caused the immune system to be unable to control HPV infections, leading to the development of massive, tree-like growths of skin tissue that could cover large portions of the body. The condition was particularly devastating because the growths were not simply cosmetic problems, but could interfere with normal body functions, making it difficult to move, work, or even perform basic daily activities. In severe cases, the growths could become so extensive that they threatened the patient's life by interfering with circulation or by becoming infected. What made Didi's case particularly unusual was the extreme severity of his condition and the rapid progression of the growths. Most documented cases of epidermodysplasia verruciformis developed slowly over many years, but Didi's condition had progressed from a simple thorn wound to extensive bark-like growths in a matter of months. By the time Didi's diagnosis was confirmed, the bark-like growths had spread to cover both of his hands completely, rendering them virtually useless for any kind of manual work. The growths had also begun to appear on his forearms and were starting to develop on other parts of his body, including his chest and legs. The transformation of Didi's hands was particularly dramatic and disturbing. What had once been normal human hands had become gnarled, club-like appendages covered in thick, bark-like tissue that cracked and bled with any movement. The growths had extended from his fingers in branch-like protrusions that made his hands look more like the roots of a tree than human appendages. The texture of the affected skin was remarkably similar to tree bark, complete with ridges, furrows, and the rough, fibrous quality that characterized woody plant tissue. The color had also changed dramatically, becoming dark brown and mottled in a way that made the affected areas look more like wood than human skin. The weight of the growths was also becoming a significant problem. Each of Didi's hands now weighed several pounds more than normal, making it exhausting for him to lift his arms or to maintain them in any position for extended periods. The constant strain on his shoulders and back was causing chronic pain that interfered with his sleep and his ability to function normally. Dr. Henderson attempted several treatments to control the progression of Didi's condition. He performed surgical removal of some of the larger growths, but these procedures were extremely painful, and the growths invariably returned within a few months, often growing back larger and more extensive than before. The surgical procedures were particularly challenging because the bark-like tissue was extremely hard and difficult to cut, requiring special instruments and techniques. The tissue also bled heavily when cut, and the wounds healed slowly and poorly, often becoming infected despite careful post-operative care. The physician also tried various topical treatments, including acids and caustic substances that were designed to burn away the abnormal tissue. However, these treatments caused severe pain and scarring without providing any lasting benefit, and they sometimes seemed to stimulate even more aggressive growth of the bark-like lesions. As Didi's condition worsened, he became unable to continue his work as a gardener. The loss of function in his hands made it impossible for him to perform the delicate tasks that had been his specialty, and the progressive spread of the growths to other parts of his body made even simple physical activities increasingly difficult. Colonel Ashworth, to his credit, continued to provide housing and financial support for Didi and his family, recognizing that the gardener's condition was not his fault and that he deserved continued care and support. However, the loss of his livelihood was devastating for a man who had taken such pride in his skill and expertise. The psychological impact of the disease was perhaps even more severe than the physical effects. Didi had always been a proud and independent man who took satisfaction in his ability to provide for his family and to excel at his chosen profession. The progressive loss of function in his hands and the increasingly grotesque appearance of his body left him feeling humiliated and worthless. Didi's family also struggled to cope with his transformation. His wife Kamala remained devoted to caring for him, but their children found it increasingly difficult to accept their father's changed appearance. The youngest child, Mira, seemed particularly frightened by Didi's bark-like hands and would often cry when he tried to touch or hold her. The social isolation that resulted from Didi's condition was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his suffering. Neighbors and former friends began to avoid him, some believing that his condition was contagious or that it was the result of some kind of curse or divine punishment. Even within the estate's Indian community, Didi found himself increasingly isolated as people struggled to understand and accept his transformation. Dr. Henderson documented Didi's case extensively, taking detailed photographs and measurements to track the progression of the disease. These images, which were published in medical journals throughout the British Empire, showed the horrifying transformation of a normal human being into something that seemed more plant than animal. The photographs revealed the full extent of Didi's condition by 1910, when the bark-like growths had spread to cover not only his hands and arms, but also significant portions of his chest, back, and legs. The growths had taken on an increasingly tree-like appearance, with branch-like protrusions extending from various parts of his body and giving him the appearance of a human tree. The medical community's fascination with Didi's case led to his being examined by numerous physicians and researchers who traveled to Calcutta specifically to study his condition. While this attention contributed to medical knowledge about epidermodysplasia verruciformis, it also subjected Didi to the humiliation of being treated as a medical curiosity rather than as a human being deserving of compassion and dignity. Some of these medical examinations were conducted with little regard for Didi's comfort or privacy, as physicians sought to document every aspect of his condition for scientific purposes. He was photographed extensively, often in poses that emphasized the most grotesque aspects of his transformation, and these images were circulated widely in medical publications without consideration for the impact on Didi or his family. The progression of Didi's condition accelerated during 1910 and 1911 as the bark-like growths became increasingly extensive and began to interfere with basic bodily functions. The growths on his hands had become so thick and heavy that he could no longer move his fingers at all, and similar developments on his feet made walking extremely difficult and painful. The skin lesions also began to develop secondary complications, including bacterial infections that caused fever and systemic illness. The cracks and fissures in the bark-like tissue provided entry points for bacteria, and Didi's compromised immune system was unable to fight off these infections effectively. By early 1911, Didi's condition had progressed to the point where he was bedridden most of the time, unable to care for himself and requiring constant assistance from his family. The weight and bulk of the growths made it difficult for him to move, and the constant pain from cracked and infected lesions made sleep nearly impossible. Didi Sharma died on September 23, 1911, at the age of 38, after more than 2 years of progressive transformation from a normal human being into something that resembled a living tree. His death was attributed to respiratory and cardiac failure resulting from the extensive bark-like growths that had consumed his body. The man whose hands became gnarled wood teaches us about the fragility of human existence and the ways in which disease can transform not just our bodies, but our entire sense of identity and place in the world. His story stands as a testament to human suffering and endurance, while also serving as a reminder of how far medical science has advanced in understanding and treating rare conditions.